range from the soul to the state as we cultivate those virtues and explore those principles that help us live well as faithful Catholics in this great land. Hey, well, welcome back for another episode, folks. It is feeling a little bit like winter here in South Dakota, the upper Midwest. We've had our first snowfall on the eastern side of the state. You know, out west, they beat us to the punch by at least a couple of weeks. I know they got a couple of feet of snow up in the hills. It was back in October even, but I know my kids are enjoying the first snowfall. It's just one of the nice things about living in a place where you get all these seasons. It's really beautiful to kind of experience nature in that way. So we're kind of well out of our Respect Life Month series, and we're kind of jumping back into a mix of different things. Today we're going to talk about religious freedom. Specifically, we're going to talk about Solemnity of Christ the King, which is coming up here on November 21st, Sunday, November 21st. Really, really beautiful feast day that, I don't know, I guess as a kid, I never really learned that much about it or thought much about it. But in my work in the last few years, have really been just growing to love this feast. To talk about the feast, I've got joining me today a previous guest on this podcast, Dr. Aaron Weldon, joining us from the Religious Freedom Committee at the USCCB. Aaron, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's good to talk to you again.
Yeah.
And a little jealous of your weather right now. Maybe I won't be jealous in like February, but
yeah, that's
but
right.
Right now when it's warm, it's still warm here, or it's been warm here. So I'm thinking about kids playing in the snow. Sounds like fun.
No, it's, the snow is great. But even just like Thanksgiving time, it's nice to have like a nice crisp in the air for the backyard football. So I'm sure our snow here in Sioux Falls is going to be gone, but it's going to feel like fall, which is great.
Yeah.
So Aaron, tell us, it's been a couple of years since we recorded a show. The last time I was out in D.C. for the annual meeting of the State Catholic Conference Directors, and you were kind enough to let me borrow your equipment. I sat down across the desk from you in your desk there at the USCCB headquarters. So it's been a while. Just tell us, we've picked up, I think, a lot of new listeners in that time. Just give us a sense of, who you are, what you do, I don't know, your family life, and what you do at the USCCB.
Sure. Yeah. Well, in terms of family life, we actually just welcomed about 3 months ago, welcomed our fourth child into the world.
Congratulations.
So that's exciting. Wednesday was my last day of paternity leave. I've got 3 boys and now a little baby girl. We live kind of in the suburbs of DC and in Prince George's County, Maryland. I've been here at the Bishops' Conference, I think, for 11 or 12 years, starting off as actually a CCHD intern. And I've been in this role as Religious Liberty Program Specialist. I think it's probably been about 6 or 7 years. In terms of what I do for the Committee for Religious Liberty, we have a quite small team here that serves that committee as staff. We have our director, who's also an attorney and plays the role of policy advisor. He also has some background in working for the federal government, so he kind of is monitoring rulemaking and that sort of thing. And that side of issues.
That's Dan, right? Dan Balzerac?
Yeah, that's Dan Balzerac.
Yeah,
mm-hmm. Yeah, so he's our director, but he also kind of has to wear multiple hats because we're such a small team. Yep. And then our Lauren McCormick is our director of government relations, but she's really the one who's our advocate on Capitol Hill, keeping up, tracking legislation for us and all that. So then my role is primarily to assist with the kind of pastoral and outreach side of our work. What that means concretely is I'm working on materials for Religious Freedom Week, Solemnity of Christ the King. We have some other projects that I work on, such as we have a blog, a podcast. A new thing that we are doing right now is that we're getting off the ground is an essay contest for Catholic. I guess you wouldn't have to go to a Catholic school because we'll advertise publicly, but we're mostly advertising through Catholic schools for juniors and seniors. So that's kind of exciting, and that'll be fun. There will actually be, prizes for the winners and all of that. So So I'm helping to organize the essay contest. And anyway, that's sort of my role. In terms of my background, my background is in theology. You introduced me as Dr. Weldon. So I do have although I don't usually go by doctor, but I do have a PhD in systematic theology and try to bring that perspective. We've got the attorney, the advocacy, legislative expert. So I try to bring some of the theology background to some of these things.
And remind me, maybe you told me last time, but where did you earn your PhD?
Catholic University of America here in DC. That's why we moved to DC in the first place, was for me to go to graduate school, and did not think that we would end up staying here. Planned to be here for 4 or 5 years to get the degree and move on. But then, like I said, I started working as an intern with CCHD. And as we started having children and got settled here in DC, just decided the life of going from place to place to try to find an academic job is just not, it's not what we thought we wanted. So, we bought a house, and there's a very strong Catholic community or communities, I should say, in different pockets of the Washington area. And so we kind of live in one of those. In fact, just yesterday, we walked to a friend's house to celebrate Martin Moss, the feast of St. Martin of Tours. And, it was kind of fun. Like, we walked, a lot of kids, a lot of families with lanterns. Some people made the lanterns out of turnips. It was a very traditional, and then had a bonfire and sang songs and all of that. So I don't know, there's just awesome. A lot of things like that we just don't want to leave. So
that's awesome. That's really incredible. And I remember asking you last time we visited about just, where you live and what life is like and community life. It's really beautiful. I think I'm familiar with the Catholic community kind of around Hyattsville, St. Jerome's.
Yeah, that's where we are.
Oh, you are? Okay. So my wife is using their curriculum she does she gets together with some other families every day to homeschool. The rector at the cathedral where we live, they have kind of some empty classrooms. He's kind enough to let them use a classroom, and so that's they're familiar with that school project, and what a gift that curriculum and the whole document has been to them. So hey, I got to jump into, so you've got 9 bishops and archbishops on your committee. And I know you're not allowed to play favorites because you're working for them, right? But I don't work for them. So we can play favorites here in the upper Midwest. I just recognize Bishop Andrew Cousins, auxiliary bishop of St. Paul in Minneapolis, has just been reassigned. He's going to be installed as bishop up in Crookston, Minnesota. Here in the upper Midwest, I think that Bishop Cousins has a special place in a lot of our hearts. And other names, other bishops on the committee too, that people recognize: Cardinal Dolan. Obviously, outsized personality and strong leadership in the church in America for quite some time. People will recognize the name of Archbishop Naumann, who has got a really strong pro-life sort of profile, if you will. But amazing work of the committee. And one of the things that kind of caught my eye is your committee this year highlighted. I know in the past we've talked about this Fortnight for Freedom, and to kind of highlight the work of your committee is this. Well, it started out as Fortnight for Freedom, but then it got, I think, kind of retooled a little bit, rebranded. But we were looking at this time right between, what was it, the 22nd of June, which was the day on which it's the feast of Thomas More and Bishop Fisher. It was the day that Bishop Fisher was himself executed. Thomas wasn't executed till a couple weeks later. So that time, right, starting on the 22nd, leading up through the 4th of July, is to really highlight this Fortnight for Freedom, to highlight religious freedom. But this year I saw some materials out of your committee kind of highlighting the Solemnity of Christ the King, which is a great opportunity to talk about this. What is it? Why? So maybe, Aaron, could you just tell us a little bit about what is this Solemnity of Christ the King? Why should we, care more about it?
Yeah. Well, first, maybe just some basics about it. The Solemnity of Christ the King, you mentioned it falls November 21st this year, but it is celebrated on the last Sunday in ordinary time. And there's kind of, we can go into the background of it a little bit later if you want, or I could say something about it now.
No, please. Please.
Either way. So, the idea in terms of the origins of the solemnity, It was instituted in 1925 by Pope Pius XI with his encyclical Quas Primas. And what is happening in 1925, so that's relatively recent, right? I mean, that's less than 100 years ago that it was instituted. One of the issues that he's addressing with the encyclical and with the institution of this feast day is this kind of really militant, aggressive, secularism is probably too weak of a word. It's a kind of anti-Catholicism, anti-clericalism that had arisen in places like Mexico and Russia and some parts of Europe. And so there was this real, like, he himself refers to this problem of Jesus Christ and his law being thrust out of society. So not sort of, there was a real, like, pushing Catholicism out of any kind of public life, and Christianity out of public life. And so the feast is instituted. This idea of Christ the King, celebrating Christ the King, is instituted in that particular kind of context. Part of the idea there is that regardless of what political regime we find ourselves under, that Christ is always the ruler over all of the universe, right? One of the other interesting things about it is that we don't often think about. I was actually just rereading Quas Primas, and this sort of jumped out to me this time because I've been teaching permanent diaconate candidates Christology. But as some people might know, the Council of Nicea was in 325. So this was, the 16th centenary of the Council of Nicea, which established that Jesus Christ is true God and true man, consubstantial, where we get that consubstantial with the Father language. And so the idea then is that Jesus is the king, not just over governments, but over all things, over all creation, because he's fully man, but he is God, right? And so he has a line, Pius XI does, about it being that his kingship is based on the hypostatic union, which is sort of a fancy theological term, just saying that, like, the union of both the divine and human nature in a single person. So that's kind of an interesting little tidbit to it. A couple other things, though, that about the feast day that can, that people might think is kind of interesting in terms of its history, is that originally it was celebrated on the last Sunday in October. And in fact, for those communities and parishes that use the old calendar or do the traditional Latin Mass, it still falls on that day, which, interestingly enough, this year that was Halloween, because the reason for that is because it was meant to have a connection with the Feast of All Saints. The idea is that where we really see Christ's reign and kind of manifested is in the lives of the saints. And so there was a connection between All Saints Day and Christ the King. And in fact, I noticed, I think it was this year's, the USCCB social media post for All Saints Day, the depiction was a stained glass window, I think, as I recall. I'm pretty sure it was the USCCB. It showed a picture of a stained glass window with the angels and saints surrounding Jesus. And you see that connection, because that very easily could have been used as a Christ the King image, because they're surrounded around Jesus and the throne.
Yes.
And so you'll notice that Christ the King and All Saints imagery typically go together. Christ the King, All Saints, and the Sacred Heart are all sort of bound up together. Now, after the reforms of Vatican II, the feast was moved to the final Sunday of Ordinary Time. And I really think, that works really well too, because it acts as a kind of is a capstone, or sums up the liturgical year. If you think about the liturgical year celebrating all these events and salvation history, sort of culminates, all of that kind of culminates in Christ, who is the Lord over all all of history and over all things. But it also still, you get a bit of a transition into Advent, because you recall those first couple of weeks of Advent are not, they are looking, they're mostly looking kind of like towards the end of time.
Yes.
And they don't use the language of kingship, but they are alluding to this idea of the fulfillment of God's kingdom. So you kind of get this, you talk about Christ's kingship, then you sort of reset and go back with the Advent to looking ahead, and then it ends up with the sort of fulfillment with Christ the King at the end.
Well, what you're saying now may resonate. I mean, it's really resonating with me. Other people in the Diocese of Sioux Falls, where I happen to live, we've got this really beautiful chapel of the Sacred Heart at our cathedral, and it was commissioned by Bishop Robert Carlson when he was Bishop of Sioux Falls, and it's just this beautiful. It's a wall-wide painting. It's actually a triptych, but it's kind of the divisions are hidden by these pillars, and it's Christ, the Sacred Heart, and he's on a throne, and it's really beautiful. It's he's clearly a king, and he's surrounded by all these saints, and the saints chosen are saints that have a particular devotion to the heart of Jesus. But it's really calling to mind what you're saying right now of this link between the saints and Christ's kingship. So it's such a compelling image. I'm going to drop a link to that image in the show notes so people can go take a look at it. But I never knew that. Thanks for pointing that out. One of the things that I want to talk about a little bit, we need to talk about, Aaron, is the link between this solemnity and the work of your committee. You have this kind of foundational document, if I can call it that, for the work of your committee. It's called Our First Most Cherished Liberty. And that document, again, I'll put a link to that in the show notes for folks. But this document makes reference to the solemnity of Christ the King. Can you talk a little bit about that, this link between the kingship of Christ, sovereign Lord of all, and religious liberty?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it might help to give a little bit of background even to the committee then too, about like what we do.
Yes.
I mean, so before we had this, our standing committee for religious liberty, we had the ad hoc committee for religious liberty, which was primarily started in response to the HHS contraceptive mandate, where, as many people know, was the HHS rule, which in the process of implementing the Affordable Care Act, it required employers to cover contraceptives in their healthcare plans. We always get this, many of us are aware of the Little Sisters of the Poor. That's kind of what they're fighting against. So that was one of the issues, or one of the things that was at issues in the creation of the ad hoc committee. But the bishops were also concerned about, different other areas where religious liberty seemed to be being infringed upon. They could see that marriage redefinition, or issues related to marriage redefinition, was on the horizon. There's also concerns about student groups on campuses not being able to determine their own leaders because of what they call all comers policies. And all those, and you can go to Our First Most Cherished Liberty and see like several of those issues related to immigration, number of different kinds of issues related to religious liberty. But to get to basics, like what are we talking about with religious liberty at all? I think that to sum it up, the issue, the thing that we are trying to promote is the space for people to fulfill their obligation to God, for all people.
Yeah.
That it's in our nature to pursue the truth about questions that we could call religious questions.
Yep.
And then when we grasp that truth, we have a duty or an obligation to respond. And so then when a government tries to force people to act in a way that's contrary to their conscience, or when it prevents people from giving God what is his due, then that government's violating this fundamental right that people have to religious freedom, that all people have. And, it's not only governments. You could talk about other, aspects of civil society and that sort of thing. But often our work ends up being focused on these sorts of legal and political types of issues. But so then Christ the King, if the solemnity reminds us that Jesus reigns as the sovereign Lord over all the universe. Then it is also becomes a reminder that a state has no right to attempt to throw religion out of public life. And so then in that sense, no matter what political regime we find ourselves under, that we are always called to serve the Lord with our whole hearts, and to serve him in a not just a private but publicly, like with our whole lives. That's one of the a refrain throughout Quas Primas, is this idea that he reigns over all. And so that means in our own lives that there's no aspect of our life that does not belong to him. And I think that when you're talking about religious freedom issues, you're talking about, there's a sense in which with these religious freedom issues that governments are almost asking us to kind of divide up our lives. Like, well, your religion is fine in your private life, but when you're in the market, or when you when you serve the public in some way, that your religion is supposed to somehow fall away. And the solemnity of Christ the King says, Christ, everything belongs to Christ. You can't divide, you don't divide it up like that. So
yeah, and that's a major feature of the document, Our First Most Cherished Liberty. One of its kind of main heading that's bold: religious liberty is more than freedom of worship. And my recollection is that under the Obama administration, there was this sort of rhetorical attempt to try and put religion in a box, and that box was Sunday, or whatever your Sabbath happened to be. But as I've understood the work of the committee through the years, is we need to actually resist that and sort of breathe deeply, flap our wings a little bit, and get out into every other day of the week with our faith too. Is that fair?
Exactly. Yeah. There seemed to be this trend. I don't see it as much anymore. But because no American is going to say that religious liberty is bad, right? It's just too much a part of our DNA as a country.
Yeah.
Like almost all polling data that I'm aware of, or anytime you see these things come up, if people are just asked, are you in favor of religious liberty? Everybody's going to say, yes, I think religious liberty is good. But then, yes, there seemed to be this trend for a while of not using the term religious liberty, but using the term freedom of worship.
Yes.
I suspect that polled well with certain groups, and that's why that became a thing, that people were using it for a while. Maybe it's not polling as well, why I don't seem like I hear it quite as much.
Yep.
But yeah, but then that does seem to imply, like, well, that all that matters is what you do in your liturgical life, or whether you're talking about Catholic or any other group, that sort of like, well, within the walls of your church or place of worship, you're sort of free to do what you want, but then your religion doesn't make its way out in any way. And so, yes, that's definitely, you think about the Catholic Church is involved in education, in healthcare, in humanitarian service. I mean, we're involved in so much.
Yeah.
They're in so many kinds of ministries, maybe more than any other religious group in the U.S. That the idea that we could just be constricted, or that we could restrict what is religion to church, it just doesn't. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, I think, to the Catholic mind.
Well, and there's this quote too in the document, making reference to Thomas Jefferson, who had written a letter to the Ursuline sisters. They'd been running these humanitarian services, hospitals, orphanages, schools in Louisiana. They started doing this in 1727. And he told them that the principles of the Constitution were a sure guarantee, quote unquote, that their ministry would be free, quote, to govern itself according to its own voluntary rules without interference from the civil authority, end quote. So there's like this stark example, as you say, that this is kind of bound up in our American DNA from our very earliest days. Aaron, we've got, let's see, about 3 minutes left here. I want to talk a little bit about we've kind of similarities between the context, this quas primus adopted, coming up on 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. Similarities between that context and our post-Christian society today. There was like this real militant secularism, which maybe is not even a sufficient word. But what is what you've mentioned to me kind of offline, one thing that's really front of mind for your committee work right now. Can you share a little bit about that concern?
Yeah. I mean, I think that in terms of similarities and differences, I mean, I think that where there are some similarities is this sense that the increasing lack of respect for religion, that religious reasoning is often taken to be irrational.
Yeah.
That you see skepticism about having respect for religion at all. And on the other hand, I mean, I kind of go back and forth on this, because on the other hand, sometimes it seems to me that the clashes that we have in American life have more to do with particular issues rather than religion as such, if that makes sense. Like those communist regimes they were militantly atheistic. They wanted religion as religion out.
Yeah.
Today's disagreements, it's usually just like kind of a disagreement over where religion clashes with contemporary mores. But as I mentioned to you earlier, we've seen an increase in attacks on Catholic churches and statues in recent years. I think we've been keeping track of that since 2020.
Yeah.
Different attacks, and I think we're up to 111 attacks, and that's just what we've recorded. I've had some people contact me offline and say that they've had these vandalism issues too.
Yeah.
It's just that it didn't get picked up by the local news.
Sure.
So there's certainly more than just 111. We've looked a little bit, at the, it's very hard to track hate crimes and that sort of stuff, but we do have some reasons to believe that there actually has been a slight uptick in these things. And so it does kind of make you wonder, like, as our country becomes more secular, you combine that with some intensifying political polarization, that maybe it isn't just going to be debates about particular issues like marriage redefinition, but that there may actually be overt hostility towards Christianity starting to build up.
Well, all the more reason to just really dedicate ourselves to Christ the King on this upcoming feast. Dr. Aaron Weldon, just so grateful for you joining the show with us today.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much.
And thank you, as always, dear listeners. I hope you are prepared for the great feast of Christ the King coming up on Sunday, November 21st. Until next time, live well.